Hi, Charlotte.
Hi, Tom.
Hi. So today I'm with my friend Charlotte Cunningham. We've been close friends since we met in our first term at Oxford University. Charlotte, after Oxford, has carved out a very interesting career through the Arts Centre, which she established and has directed for over 2 decades now. It helps all kinds of people, but in particular, it helps disadvantaged people, disabled people, young and old with dementia and other things. But, you know, it maybe wasn't so easy for Charlotte to forge her own path because like many people who have, you know, successful or prominent grandparents or parents, Charlotte's family on both sides is also the case. On her mother's side, her grandmother was the head of the Luxembourg royal family, the Grand Duchess Charlotte, after whom Charlotte is named. And perhaps even more prominently on the American side of her family, her grandfather, Douglas Dillon, was the US Secretary of State under a Republican, Eisenhower, but then he was US Treasury Secretary under a Democrat, Kennedy, and after Kennedy was tragically assassinated, he also served under a third president, Lyndon Johnson, and he was also, I might mention, on the National Security Council during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Anyway, I'm speaking to Charlotte in Yorkshire in the north of England, where she's spending the coronavirus lockdown period with her great husband, Mark, who's also a good friend of mine, and their 3 sons. So, Charlotte, let's start at the beginning. Let's start with the American side of your family, in other words, your mother's side of your family. Tell me a little bit about them.
Well, I was actually born in New York, although I've never lived in America. I came back to Luxembourg very quickly afterwards, but I was born there because my mother obviously had grown up there. She left the United States when she was quite young, about 18 or 19, and came to live in Paris when her father, Douglas Dillon, the one you mentioned, was made ambassador in Paris in 1953, I think it was. So she was already European, but she according to her, got stuck in the States because she wasn't allowed to travel anymore. So I was born in New York City. And I have a very close relationship with my American family. I have an American sister and aunts and a few cousins. I spend every summer in Maine, which is on a little island off the East Coast.
Your American sister's the older one from your mother's first marriage, right?
Yeah, yeah. Mm-hmm.
And what about your father's side of the family, the Luxembourg? How does one say it? Luxembourgish, Luxembourger side of the family?
I say Luxembourgish. So yes, I then returned and I lived in a house actually in a rather 18th century fashion with my grandmother, my aunt, a couple of my cousins. There are 27 first cousins on that side. So we're a big family, but all very close. And my first 8 years were spent in the Luxembourgish countryside in that situation. So it was
just sorry to interrupt, because I'm afraid to say many of us, including myself, don't know too much about Luxembourg. I mean, I know you don't like to call yourself this, but technically you are actually a princess of Luxembourg. And I remember at Oxford, before you married Mark and obviously took his surname Cunningham, you were Charlotte Luxembourg. I mean, how was it living in, let's say, a royal court with your grandmother in the first years of your life? I mean, I personally am actually a Republican, and I think it's a bit ridiculous to still have royal families, but that's just my humble opinion.
For a start, I mean, I understand your republicanism, but I think I'm quite proud of some of the things that my family on that side have done, particularly my grandmother, who led the country during the Second World War. She was actually never meant to be head of state. Her older sister was originally in her place, but there was some controversy after the First World War, and Luxembourg actually had a choice of becoming a republic, but they decided to go for the second sister. And so that's when she stepped up, when she was still very young. And she there was a lot has been kind of written, and also there's a great film about her, because she then moved actually to London eventually, and she used to go on the BBC and speak to her people, if you like.
This is during the war, because her older sister in the First World War had allowed the Germans, then the Kaiser, in, right, in Luxembourg. But in the Second World War, your grandmother, who was then the ruling monarch of Luxembourg, certainly did not want to side with Hitler and went into exile in London. Is that right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. She and all her children, including my father, who was the fifth child, so the second last, she had 6 children. Yes, they fled. I mean, they very much, you know, they remember kind of shots being fired at the cars and things as they crossed the border. So, and the children, my father actually grew up in America. Part of his time was spent in Canada and America, because he and his father and the younger siblings went to the States. The older siblings then came back and actually went to school in England. And their mother was also living in London, in Hampstead.
Okay, so
happened.
some of them came back after the Second World War, and some of them continued living for a little while longer in England or Canada.
They all came back at the end of the Second World War. They all came back, yeah.
I see. Okay, and then let me remember correctly, yes, your father unfortunately died when you were 10. So that must have been very difficult for you to lose a father at such a young age.
It's not something I would wish on anyone, obviously, but it did change things quite significantly for my brother and I. I've got a younger brother who's 11 months younger than me, although these days he seems much older and more mature than I am ever. But
you know, I've met him a few times. I'm not sure that's quite correct, but anyway.
And so he and I were very young. I think if you lose a parent when you're quite young, it does also give you some extra resilience and hopefully a bit of empathy, so that you can also help other people in similar situations. And it changed our lives. We, you know, after that we moved, obviously, and we were both sent to school in England. And I think we may have had very different paths if that hadn't happened. So although it was a very sad time, and he had a tough time, I think, beforehand. These things happen, and I think you can take some strength from them as well. So I'm a constant optimist. I think he had a lot of demons. I think it was difficult, you know, growing up. He actually went and liberated the concentration camps at the end of the war. I think
as a soldier, or
he went with the Luxembourgish army, yeah. So looking for Luxembourgers who were still in the camps, and he was, I think, probably 18 at the time. So you imagine those types of experiences kind of stay with you. And yes, he had a hard time thereafter, I would say.
I mean, since we mentioned the concentration camps, I know obviously you and your family are very Catholic, or I don't know about you, but your family is. But you discovered, I think, you know, later after Oxford, that your grandfather, the American grandfather, actually was partly of Polish Jewish origin. They converted, so possibly back in Poland, they were distant cousins that probably ended up in those camps. So,
absolutely, yeah, absolutely. Yes, my great-great-grandfather, or my great-grandfather, who I still knew quite well on the American side, Clarence Dillon. He died when he was 96, so I was in my kind of teens, I think. And he had changed his name to Dillon. He had been born Lepowski. So
which name?
Lepowski. So there was definitely
the Polish Jewish side. Anyway, so you moved to England and went to, after your father passed away, you went to boarding school in England. It was like one of those Catholic public schools, which, you know, for Americans watching this, that means private school, but in England, for some strange reason, we still call them public schools, even though they're private schools, and public schools called state schools, but go figure. So you've basically, or not basically, you've lived in England ever since. I mean, how was it for you suddenly going to a boarding school in another country? I mean, was it good? Was it fun? Was it difficult?
It was actually, I think it was a very good decision on behalf of my mother. She was quite clever that way, and she had thought through the fact that she had brought up one child already in France earlier on, and thought that that was probably not the best idea for us.
That's
and
your
she thought,
American half sister, right? Your older American half sister,
yeah. And she chose a school it was called Woldingham Sacred Heart. And she chose it because she thought it felt very cozy. It had teddy bears on the beds and things like that. And she felt that that would be a place that would give us security, or give me security. My brother did not come there. His was maybe not quite such a cozy place, but that after he was at another Catholic school just down the road, also in Sussex. But I think it did, because it provided 7 years of security, and I was incredibly happy there. Both the teachers, the nuns, and all of the school children there were very supportive, and I still have, at the moment during lockdown, I'm talking to up to 20 of them on a regular basis via Zoom. So yeah, the friendships have stayed active.
Yeah, I know that you're still close friends with a number of friends from your high school, because I've met them at various dinner parties of yours and so on, and it's nice that you're almost like a family together, a kind of extended family. So Charlotte, also, look, although you have lived in England since the age of 10, you're a very, very international person. I know you spend, as you say, summers in Maine, you have family from living all over the place. And of course, I too have, we've, a group of us went to Saint-Rémy, where your parents had a house in Provence in the south of France, each summer at Oxford, and that was very nice. And Saint-Rémy, obviously, although it's small, I think the population is less than 10,000. It's quite prominent because, Van Gogh, the painter, painted some of his greatest art around there and ended up in an asylum there. And I remember also Nostradamus was born in Saint-Rémy. Anyway, we also went during Oxford to Israel, if you remember, with our very good meeting. Laura Hacker, as she was then, now Laura Barlow, and also with Stefan Prescott. I mean, that was a fun trip, I remember. Did you remember it?
I do remember it extremely well. It was a lot of fun. It was, we learned all kinds of things. At the time, I wasn't, as you say, aware of the Lepowski connection, so I was desperate to have some kind of connections, and you kept telling me that you were sure I did have, but yes, we had an amazing couple of weeks.
I remember also, though, in those days, Masada, which is the ancient fortress in the desert in southern Israel, nowadays there's a cable car to go up and down. In those days, you had to kind of walk up and down. And I remember we stayed, a group of us, of course, we slept there overnight, but because it's in the middle of a desert, it was very cold, wasn't it? We hadn't banked the temperature dropped enormously. Do you remember that?
I do. It was very stupid, and we literally had our kind of beach towels with us, and that was our, we had no blankets, no clothes, or not enough clothes, and it was not the most comfortable night we spent. It was very funny. We woke up very early in the morning. And I think I remember that there was then suddenly a large group of tourists who'd appeared. I think you couldn't, as you said, there were no cable cars, but you could get up halfway up the mountain by bus or something. So we were kind of woken up by people coming to see the sunrise, and we were slightly horrified.
Masada used to be an ancient. There was, I think, an ancient Jewish king of Judea that fought off the Romans for 3 years from the top of Masada. So it was once upon a time a more comfortable dwellings than it is today. In fact, I don't think I'm allowed to sleep on there anymore. But it was. I'm sure
you're not.
No, it was fun. Anyway,
we probably weren't then either, but
maybe not. Anyway, so let's move to the kind of bread and butter of your career. Your arts centre and organisation. I know it started in Hammersmith, but now you seem to go all over the country helping people. Let me ask you, it's called Turtle Key. Why is it called Turtle Key?
Well, there's a nice kind of symbolism in that the turtle was the symbol of man's intuitive knowledge of truth. So you have to unpick that one a little bit, but it's got lots of possibilities. And the key was the symbol of something called the Sesame Institute, which was where my then partner had trained, and which was a drama therapy institute. So it's all about unlocking, and our strapline is unlocking creative potential. So the two work together quite well, and that's where Turtle Key came from.
And tell me a bit more, I know we've spoken about it, but I maybe haven't asked enough in the past when we've chatted, because you say things like you work with dementia, older people, and we work with younger people, and we always seem to be on trains all over England going to drama workshops and this and that. Of course, I remember even when we were at Oxford, you helped stage some theatrical productions, because as a kid I was a big Asterix fan, the French comic book. You put on a play of Asterix and the Big Fight, you and Laura.
Yeah.
And I also remember you spending a few months in Munich working to the theatre there as part of your course when you were at Oxford. So you always had a theatrical background or part of your days. But tell me exactly what arts, it's not just theatre, right? Turtle Key, it's other.
No, so I mean, how it all started was that when after Oxford, I did want to work in theatre, but I didn't really want to go back and do another degree. I initially, when I moved to London, got an internship or a job at something called the Terence Higgins Trust, which was an organisation that worked with people. Now we say people with HIV, then we did talk about people with AIDS. So that gave me some experience for a few months in how to work in an office. And then I was looking for theatre work. I worked in a little pub theatre in Hampstead, and we were putting on a Shakespeare play. It wasn't very good. The director wasn't very nice, but the movement director was a very nice woman who I made friends with. And she and I were both interested in the idea of opening a theatre that would be accessible. So mainly to people with physical disabilities, because she at the time was living with someone who was in a wheelchair, but also more generally. And that's how this concept was born, that we would open a building that had access to all, that we would create ramps and hearing loops and things at the time, and that would be something that carried on for quite a long time. In terms of putting on plays, it provided platforms for disabled actors and musicians and dancers, but also, the technicians. And it was designed to be accessible and to provide work. And that has carried on. So the philosophy of that has carried on throughout the work, even though the building no longer exists.
And in fact, I know that, today, there's maybe not enough, but there's somewhat more help for disabled people, and there's kind of art therapy and drama therapy. But when you started it, you were, as far as I know, you were somewhat of a pioneer. There was much less of this kind of help for integrating disabled people and giving them meaning and roles, I think. Is that correct?
Yes, there was very little. There were particularly very few buildings that people could even access at the time. We're quite proud of the fact that a lot of the people who took part in our we used to run festivals. We had something called the Upstart Festival, and many of the people who were part of that then many years later turned up on the stage at the Paralympics as artists, and they're now prominent disabled artists. And I think it was quite exciting at the time. It felt quite political almost to be part of that movement, and things have moved a long way. I think the fear is always that things can change again, and so you have to be quite vigilant in making sure that those issues are still at the forefront.
Attitudes for the disabled people, you mean?
Yeah, disabled artists being given the proper both support in terms, so to be able to do their work, but also the stages to be able to perform their work on. So yes, it was a very different landscape in those days, and I'm proud that we were maybe a small part of helping it to change.
No, I know that you're a fairly small organisation, Turtle Key, but you've done a lot with limited staff and limited resources. And in fact, I know that you would be much too modest to ever tell me this, but Laura, who we mentioned before, who's on your board, she mentioned that you got an MBE for your work in the arts, helping disabled people. So congratulations.
Yeah, that was more for work with young people, but I feel very strongly that it was not my accolade, that it was very much a team accolade, because as you say, we're such a small team. And all of the work that we've done over the last decades has not been a one person job.
Sure. Of course. But nevertheless, your whole team, of course, deserves credit. Although, by the way...
can I just tell you an anecdote, which is quite nice about it, is that because I'm foreign, the great thing was that I was able to go and pick up the medal at the Department of Education, rather than doing it formally in the way people usually do and going to the palace or anything, and which meant that my whole team was able to come with me. So it felt like actually it was all of us getting it, which made it much.
And you know what? I'm sure when they decided to award that, they were in essence awarding your whole team through you as well. But by the way, just on a side note, for non-British people watching this, MBE is one of those awards the British government gives out, and it actually stands, I think, for Member of the British Empire. There are also OBEs and CBEs also with the British Empire. And it does seem a little bit bizarre that here we are in the year 2020, and just recently there have been all these Black Lives Matters and a very belated re-evaluation of British colonial history. It does seem a bit bizarre that honours should still have the title British Empire in them, but that's just my little side note. I don't know if you...
I think the whole honours system is fairly bizarre, and probably, I don't know much about it in other countries, but I know that London was given the Legion of Honour yesterday by the French president, so a city has got it now. But yes,
they're trying to get an advantage in the Brexit negotiations or something.
It's an odd one. Definitely.
Although America has many faults, I prefer the American way, where people are not made not given titles and honours and have the House of Lords and all that kind of stuff. That's my, I think it's a bit ridiculous but no, I'm not saying awards shouldn't be given. I just think...
As we've seen in the last years, it doesn't always work so well in the States either. So
no, it's the problem to get to find the perfect form of governance in any society has unfortunately not yet happened. So maybe I shouldn't be so quick to dismiss the idea of monarchies playing roles, whether in England or Luxembourg or anywhere else.
I think it's all around good leadership, and if it happens that there are good leaders that occur within those families, I agree that it's a little bit bizarre when you pick it apart, but there have been some really impressive leaders, and I do think you've got to hand it to the Queen in the UK. I mean, there's but equally in my family there have been some really good people, and I think that's what it comes down to.
No, you're right. Queen Elizabeth has been a steadying force over the decades in England, and is played a very important role. It was more the institution I'm not sure about.
Yeah.
She personally is to be admired. So we're almost out of time, but just finally, whenever I pop round, there always seems to be rather dynamic and eclectic house guests you have staying from all kinds of backgrounds and people. I also, you had your nephew Alexander staying for a while. I remember him showing me, I won't do it now, but he put his lip down and showed me a tattoo on his inner lip that I thought, oh my God, it must be very painful. But apparently he was proud of that hidden tattoo. But anyway, on a more serious note, I remember a few months ago, unfortunately, someone you were close to, that photographer, passed away, and you helped. He didn't have children, so you actually organised his funeral. And just mention him, because he was a very important person, I think.
Yes, Anthony Crickmay, he was called, and he was actually the landlord when we started Turtle Key in Fulham, and he was very supportive. Obviously, he loved dance. He was a dance photographer mainly, and although we've talked about some of the things that we do, our outreach work with dementia and autism and HIV, I've gone back to working with HIV, which is lovely after all these years. But he also, you know, the other side of what we do is performance and working with young artists. And he was really excited about the fact that that we would be working with young dancers, young performers, young writers, and supporting them. And that's why he was so supportive to us and was really quite an inspiration at the early stages of our inception, if you like.
And he wasn't only a landlord. I mean, I know there was a retrospective of his photographs at the Victoria and Albert Museum, which in my opinion is one of the greatest museums of the world, actually, the V&A. And when you...
Yes, for his 80th, they celebrated him for his 80th a couple of years ago. And then he very sadly passed away in January of this year, which in some ways, you know, he missed this whole strange coronavirus moment. So that's a good thing.
Yeah, yeah. But by the way, for anybody who's interested in Anthony Crickmay's work, I did actually, it's still on the V&A website, some of his photos, very nice. And also, of course, Turtle Key's work, people can look up your website and see more of what you do. But anyway, Charlotte, I think we're probably out of time, but see you once we're both in London after this coronavirus situation.
Hopefully soon.
Yeah, good. All right. Have a great day.
Okay. Thanks, Tom.
Bye.
Bye-bye.